Hey everybody! I want to welcome you to another episode of the Advisory Board, which is a podcast that focuses on the franchise industry and business, learning how to operate at a high level with industry experts, such as my guest today, Jam. Jam, say hi to everybody.
Hey, everybody.
Guys, let me tell you about Jam before we jump into the topic. Jam Hashmi is the CEO and founder of two companies in the industry. It's ClickTex. A lot of you know him. ClickTech, right? Or ClickTex.
Click text.
Okay,
We do.
good. I forget if there's an S on the end. I've just known you for long enough, I forget. And then FranchiseSoft. So Jam's got a unique perspective. He started in the industry in 2001. He's been kind of worked from every aspect of franchise development and been very involved now helping people through his software, with lead gen on the ClickTech side, and then on franchise opening. Like once you get that deal through the door, what do you do to make sure they're successful and they're generating royalties? And that's the nature of the franchise industry. Jim, tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then we'll jump right into the topic today.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. I appreciate that. Hey, everybody. My name is Jam Hashmi, as Dave mentioned. So I started in franchising in 2001 with a franchisor, actually a platform brand now that owns about six different franchisors. And I was brand new right out of university. I studied genetics and microbiology. So as you know, there's not much room for scientists who have the gift of gab. I didn't like working in the lab as much, so I thought, hey, I'd work for a little while before I tried to reapply to med school. And my first job interview ever was with this franchisor, and they made me into a lead qualifier, and they gave me a phone, and they said, here's some trade show leads we got from Singapore, like from 2 years ago. So just call, and I didn't even know how to call Singapore from from Canada, but I figured it all out, the time zones, and I was there for about 12 years. And during my tenure, I was fortunate enough to be given some opportunities to move up, manage teams on the franchise sales side. So I placed about 600 locations for that brand across about 30 different countries. So I learned a lot about franchising, franchise sales, franchise lead generation and marketing, how we were generating leads that we
Mhm.
were awarding franchises to. And then I got to a point where I was like, hey, they said somebody's got to die before you get your next promotion, basically. So, you can move laterally into finance or operations, but it's not as much fun as franchise sales. And so I
Mhm.
thought, hey, maybe I'll go off on my own. And so I started ClickText at that time. That was about 10 years ago now, 11 years ago, actually. And started offering those same services of, lead generation, marketing, website development to a number of different franchisors. And as I offer those solutions, we found that there's a bit of a gap in the market on good software that franchisors can use to manage their franchise locations, to open, the sold not open numbers,
Mhm.
to go out there and reduce those so that more locations can be opened up. And of course, the lifeblood of any franchisor, collecting up royalties and technology fees, marketing fees, and all that. So I started FranchiseSoft, had some spare time on the weekends, built that software into a SaaS company, and so we've got a number of different franchise brands on that. Um, and that's kind of what I spend my time doing pretty much.
Mhm. Yeah. One more fun note too, before we dive into the topic today, is Jam has two kids, daughter in college, a son that's an avid basketball player. If you ever want to play a pickup game at an industry event, you can grab Jam, and he'll be a good probably power forward for you. And and I'll
I may be doing more outside shooting now. As you know, takes a bit longer to recover.
Yeah, I know. I'll be a good center. I'll get the tip, and then I'll watch you guys hustle back and forth, and I'll relay passes at the midcourt. But anyway, yeah. So let's talk about the topic today, guys. We there are a lot of challenges that people have on the franchise lead gen side. We've talked about quite a bit in the podcast. We might have you back and focus on that too, Jam,
Mhm.
as another perspective on that. But there's this challenge everybody has, whether it's emerging or established, of how do I take a deal that's been done, a franchise that's been awarded, and then how do I take that to the point where it's a healthy royalty revenue generating
Yeah.
franchise unit, because if they're generating high volumes of royalties and I'm managing them and helping them grow properly, got a really healthy franchise owner. And that's what this is all about, right? Is how do we create franchise owners that are successful and thriving, so that the end result is they produce higher volumes of royalties. And we'll talk about how you proper ways to collect that and manage it as well. So Jim, talk, if you don't mind, you got a unique perspective here because you get to see kind of the whole spectrum of the franchise industry. What do you see as some of the challenges right now people are experiencing at the emerging franchise level?
Yeah, emerging brands are, as you know, a new emerging brand comes up almost every single day.
Yeah.
People are franchising in all sorts of vertical markets. Traditional industries that were never franchising before are considering franchising as a mode of expansion and growth. Um, and the hallmark of franchising is systems, right? That's what we're selling. When we go out there and we talk about getting involved in a franchise, the buyer is
Mhm.
really looking for a blueprint. And I find that many emerging franchise brands haven't clearly defined their actual system. So they'll have maybe 2 or 3 corporate locations that have been operating, which they're kind of trying to convert into franchises. They bring in consultants who would go out there and kind of follow them around for like 2 weeks to document everything and build out a system.
Mhm.
But I find that they're not as clearly defined or as detailed as they need to be. They have a prototype, it
Mhm.
works, but that prototype is not structured for mass production. You can't rinse and repeat that easily and put it on autopilot.
Yeah.
A simple example of this is when we're working with an emerging franchisor, one of the common questions we ask is, hey, do you have your onboarding or your opening, grand opening task lists all set up? And they're like, yeah, we've got them. And then when they get time to actually document, because in order to build it into a system, a technology, and put
Yeah.
technology on it, you got to have it offline first. Um, and we ask if they know every single task that needs to be done from the time someone signs the agreement to the time they open the doors of the business. And I'm talking something as simple as ordering marketing materials or opening up a bank account or registering a tax ID number or getting the necessary permits to
Mhm.
operate that style of business.
Yeah.
And it's funny because then they realize they don't have it as detailed. And
Yeah.
oftentimes they'll go through the entire process and realize there was a critical step in phase one that they forgot to do. And a lot of items on the phase 9 were contingent on that step in phase one.
Mhm.
And that's why you end up getting a lot of those sold but not open, because people get stuck in that onboarding process because it's not documented as clearly.
Yeah.
And once they don't get them open, they're not generating any revenue. I mean, as you know, most of the franchise fee goes towards the lead sources, whether those
Mhm.
are franchise consultants, broker groups, whether those are portals that you're buying leads from, whether those are your own marketing department or agencies that are utilizing that budget to generate leads. Most of that franchise fee revenue is eaten up in that step. So you really need to get those locations opened up if you want to go out there and generate a revenue stream out of that.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, Jam, I want to circle back because you brought up a couple of really important things there. And the first one is what comes to mind is if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And a lot of emerging brands, they'll spend money, as you mentioned, to go and get a third party group, and some are better than others, really. Some are fantastic, some are charlatans, really. They don't really have clear operations experience, but they are helping people put together plans that are only half baked, but not having a true understanding of everything that has to happen, documenting it, and then having a way to follow up to ensure it's getting done. What a lot of these emerging brands do that I see is Bob handles that, right? Bob knows. Bob helped our corporate office, so Bob obviously can help this new franchise get open. Well, the challenge is Bob's been doing it for 20 years. He never had to get permitting done, right? There are all these holes in knowledge typically when you just drop it on someone. It's usually the founder,
Mm.
actually, or the founder's spouse or the founder's partner or something where they really haven't thought it through, especially with emerging brands. And there are little things that they've forgotten about because they've been in business long enough that it becomes a stumbling block. So I'm glad you brought that up because if without documenting it, without having almost a digital checklist and a process to follow up and knowing what's contingent upon something else, I think
Mhm.
that a lot of people get stuck, as you
Yeah.
mentioned before.
It's funny you mentioned that because we had a brand that it wasn't Bob, it was their COO who was
Mhm.
essentially the gentleman that had all of that knowledge, but he was retiring, and they literally had 60 days before his retirement because he announced his retirement, and they had 60 days to try to figure out how to download everything that was in his head from an
Mhm.
operations standpoint because he literally didn't have it all documented listed out. He just knew this has
Mhm.
to happen and this has to happen, and so smart gentleman got it all in his head, but the rest of the company now is in shambles, trying to go out there and extract that information, because once he retires, he's gone. All right, and
Yeah.
so they were having that challenge. That's why, as an emerging brand, it's so key to go out there and make sure some of that's documented, even if it's in an Excel spreadsheet. And you don't necessarily need a high-end system. If you've got, if you've got something documented well, great. But if you really want to scale a business, you're going to have to go out there and have some of that automated.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And you mentioned systems in general, and that's not the focus of this podcast episode, but I see a lot of brands where the HQ is using software to operate on a day-to-day basis that's not scalable also. Like these are things you have to stop and think about early on is what's the best fit for, for these resources that can scale with franchises. Once I get 10 units, can I have this cobbled together system with, Zapier and APIs trying to
Yeah.
pull it all together? Sometimes the answer is yes, but it adds a web of complexity that people don't think about. But let's not focus on that. That's another topic for another day. So how do you see effective franchise systems, emerging brands and others resolving some of these issues? Like what are some, you mentioned documenting their processes, and whether it's in a Google sheet or an Excel sheet to start, that's great. But you mentioned automating some of these onboarding processes. What does that look like? How could somebody do that?
Yeah. I mean, there's some great onboarding automated software that allows you to go out there and upload your checklists or upload your tasks. So let's say you have 500 things that need to be done from the
Mhm.
time that someone signs the agreement to the time they open the doors of their business, and then possibly another 30 tasks that need to be done post opening, right? So they have
Yeah.
pre-opening, grand opening, soft opening. Like we see all sorts of these phases during the grand openings, the cycle that the franchisor goes through. But good software would allow you to go out there and import a lot of those tasks in, then allow you to segment tasks into checklists, the
Mhm.
marketing checklist, the legal checklist, the week one checklist, the pre-opening checklist, whatever you want to label them. So some level of flexibility because each franchisor calls it something different.
Yeah.
But in order to take those 500 tasks and organize them into small bite-sized parts, and then be able to assign, you know, um, one task to one individual or maybe multiple individuals, depending on who's involved. So the ability to assign those tasks with a due date,
Mhm.
because as you know, if you just assign tasks, you don't put a due date, that always gets punted into next week, then then next year, then, and then it's never done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the
Rubber.
ability to go out there and not only upload, organize, assign with due dates, and then also have a reminder notification system. People get busy, their emails get filled up, hundreds of emails come in. But just like your calendar events, as a calendar event comes up, you get a 24-hour notice, or maybe a 48-hour notice, a 24-hour notice, and maybe even a 2-hour or 1-hour notice.
Mhm.
And it's also awesome if those systems are smart enough to say, hey, the task wasn't done. A day or 2 days have gone by. Hey, by the way, task wasn't done.
Mhm.
And so it reminds that individual that it's assigned to. This really takes the work of manually administrating those reminders and creating those tasks for each franchisee out of your support person's hands. Um, I find that to be really good. And then the really kind of high-end systems have dependency-based tasks, which means uh, phase one, task three must be completed or marked as in progress before phase five, task three can begin. So that way you can't move to the next phase until you've checked off all the boxes on the previous task. So,
Oh yeah.
um, and then layer that on with some level of reporting. Can I get a cross section of where a particular franchisee is, where they're stuck, what task they're stuck on, who was supposed to do that task, and if I can get that level of reporting, I can quickly parachute in, find where the problem is, fix it, move it on.
Yeah, I think the last couple of things you mentioned are key because anyone can start with a spreadsheet, and there's nothing wrong with that. Actually, that is better than just than keeping it in your head,
Yeah, true.
because that's not replicable. And eventually the founder has to get out of that seat and assign it to someone who's a better operator than they are. So rarely is a franchise founder an exceptional franchisor operations manager. They're usually an expert in the technology or the tools or the service that they provide. So you got to get out of that seat as soon as you can. But the visibility and the dashboarding and the
Yeah.
dependency management, the task assignment, those are the things that I see. You start to run into limitations once you have 1, 2, 3 units opening, and especially if you're like a brick and mortar and you've got to do build outs and
Oh,
permits. You mentioned that early on, but permits kill franchise rollouts. And if you're not managing that very effectively up front, then you're going to have major delays, and those sometimes can cause failure.
yeah.
So yeah, glad you brought those up. Well, so let's talk a little bit about next phase though. So having that checklist, understanding what needs to be done, but there are also blocks of things that just have to be done. People have to be trained. You have to have other reporting and visibility support tools, communication tools. You have to have the ability to then effectively track royalties. I still know brands that have hundreds of units that have P&Ls submitted every month. And then someone's got to go through the P&Ls and then plug data into some other system and then charge a royalty afterward. That's
Yeah.
nutso in my mind. So what are some effective brands doing to manage those aspects of the business?
Yeah. I mean, I think once you're getting to a point where you've got a number of locations opened up, your challenges are a bit different than when you have one or two emerging brand locations, right? So
Yeah.
established brands, I always find one of the common challenges is the inconsistent or uncoordinated communication between your head office support staff, whether they're in finance, whether they're in operations, whether they're in training, whether they're in support. But the inconsistent and uncoordinated communication between head office staff and the franchisees. And what that usually does is it leads to misalignment and operational inefficiencies. And I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
A franchisee sometimes has a query, a question, something that they need clarified from head office. So they'll communicate with people from head office in like 6 different ways. They'll email, they'll of course pick up the phone and call their support person. They'll sometimes call their sales rep, right, who is involved in the process. Sometimes they'll go out there and send emails, or maybe sometimes they'll send out social media messages through a message board. Some of them will send smoke signals. Like you've got to be able to figure out how can I consolidate all the different ways, because they're doing that various forms of communication. They're doing that with multiple support representatives. And, you know, some franchisees are smart, right? They'll try to peg one support rep against another to try to figure out, you know, if they're getting consistent messages, because they're always testing the franchisor as well.
Yeah.
Um, and what ends up happening is that some support reps may be giving a different answer than what the company's line is on that. Or they may have promised something different, and in actuality, it's something else. And so, you know, that grapevine for the franchisee network is pretty strong. And so they'll start talking amongst themselves, and now all of a sudden you've got a bigger issue than needed to be.
Mm.
So one way I find that franchisors can go out there and fix this is by centralizing the submission process of tickets or support requests using some type of a ticketing system. If they do that, they're able to go out there, create tickets. If they have the ability to then create departments, training, operations, support, finance, sales, and they can assign those tickets to the respective departments. And once those tickets are assigned to those departments, having reminders, having communication, having escalations built in. So maybe that support rep doesn't answer for 2 days. What is your system automatically doing? Is it moving it to the manager, or is it moving it to the next person in the support queue, so that the franchisee can get responded to quickly? And I find that if you can tighten that up, you're going to avoid a lot of those he said, she said scenarios, which ends up happening when there's an inconsistent way of taking in all of the support requests that franchisees have.
Yeah, that's really important. And you create something we talked about before as well, visibility as well, right? If you have some reporting to see, oh, I had 36 issues come in over the last month. They were all marketing related.
Yeah,
I should probably take a look at that with the head of the department and figure out what's the root cause. Like, why do I have so many, like a rash of these marketing things pop up? Now, we all know as you get going to franchising, no matter how good it is, the marketing is usually never good enough. But you
absolutely.
can see top level metrics that can let you know this side of the business needs attention, and as a good leader founder, like that's where your attention needs to go.
You can
So
even plug in. You can even plug in an AI that goes out there and analyzes your last 10 years of support requests that have come in,
hmm,
and they can go out there and do predictive analytics to figure out, hey, commonly we have issues that are stemming from this particular department. that allows you to go out there and resource that department, hire more, train more, or even at a bare minimum, standardize your responses for those questions so that the AI can go out there and be able to answer based on what is acceptable that you've gone out there and done before. So some smart ways that I don't think a lot of franchisors are there yet, but I think something that I think is definitely coming down the pipe is the ability to go out there and utilize that, as long as it's a closed LLM, right? Like it can't be open to the public to go out there and have that data shared outside, but
Yeah.
being able to run an AI through your existing responses that have already been given in order to automate some of that.
Yeah, AI is powerful. I didn't plan on us talking about that today, but if you have a corpus of data, meaning like a body of information that you've documented, you probably have a knowledge base, and it's probably not adequate, right? No matter how much time you put into it, there's always stuff that has to be added. But over time, as you add to it, you make it a requirement that if you answer this question, write the question here and the answer there, and you document it somehow. So first of all, your franchisees can self-serve. The
Yeah,
last thing they often want to do is call you to try to get
yeah,
an answer. They would rather sit at home in their bunny slippers, go into the knowledge base and find the answer. But
yeah,
what's even more powerful than that is when you take that type of a knowledge base and you operationalize it with AI, so they can have a natural conversation like, hey, I need help with this. How do I do that? And then the system will give them the data that you wish your rep would give them. But it's way more efficient. I think that's super smart to bring up.
yeah. Way quicker, right? Like we're in that mode where everybody wants instant gratification. So if I'm a franchisee and I only get around to sending that support request at 10:30 at night on a Friday,
Yeah.
and not a lot of support reps are working at that time. So I'd like to be able to self-serve rather than let it fester over the weekend and perhaps lose a Monday.
Mhm. Yeah, no, you're right. And these franchisees, we got to remember, franchisors, they are busting their butts, right? They're busy. They're working 10, 12 hours a day. And so sometimes the only time they've got to breathe and think about the operational issues they have is at 10:30 on a Friday.
True.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah. Well, so let's shift. So emerging brands, I think we all know, like building the processes, establishing them, working the systems, the automating things is going to make a huge difference. But the challenges shift a little bit as you start to grow. Let's say you've got 30, 40, 50 units, you've got 200 units. How do the problems change operationally, Jam, when you get to that level?
I mean, one big thing that comes into play as you start to expand your network is training and ongoing e-learning, right? They say that your single biggest competitive advantage is your ability to learn. And if you're not providing a centralized way that your franchisees can stay up to date with their industry, with new norms that are happening, your support reps are not being trained effectively, your entire system is going to suffer. And so, we've seen a lot of emergence of e-learning platforms, virtual training modules that are being used by some franchisors today. And these type of training modules, they say, anything that can be read or said should be put in some type of an e-learning environment. So that you're not using HR time. Like you're not using a human resource to go out there and repetitively say stuff that can already be perhaps pre-recorded, perhaps put into some type of a course for self-learning. And so imagine doing that, but not just for you and the franchisees, but being able to train your employees, your franchisees, and your franchisees' employees. So
Yeah.
you taking that standardization of messaging, training, best practices out of the franchisee's hand and training right to the franchisee's employees using standardized trainings. Um, and even putting in quizzes and tests at the end of every training, e-learning course,
Right.
so that you can assess comprehension. And those things are so important because otherwise, what people do with e-learning courses, they turn them on their computer and then they'll go grab a coffee, just so that the course can complete, right?
Yeah.
Fortunately, with good systems, you've got not only the ability to track how much of a video has been watched, but also engagement within that course, and most importantly, comprehension by using quizzes and tests.
Yeah, so years ago I was in the learning and development industry, and then I worked in the localization industry where we specialized in L&D content. So I'm very familiar with what you're saying. Parents are both, course developers for master's degree level programs. Like these are things that we discuss at home, but you're darn right. Like
Yeah.
learning programs have to have, it's not just about having the content spewed into a platform, right? But because everybody can figure out how to cheat and click through the learning process to get done
Mhm.
faster. Nobody wants to do it. Learning is actually a hard process for many people, but if you can make it easier with video content, engagement that's not all reading, like you got to make sure you're like an operations manual is a necessity for legal reasons, but it's never
Mhm.
gonna, it's just shelfware. So you've
Yeah.
got to take that knowledge that's in that big body of words and create an interactive environment where people can actually comprehend it. And also bear in mind, it's not just about training the franchisor, but if you let's talk about a brick and mortar. If you are a food service or a local service
Yeah.
company, a personal service company, the most important people to be trained are the frontline workers who are
Yeah.
delivering the service at scale.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that has to be consistent. If they go to one unit of your franchise in Tallahassee, Florida, they should have the exact same experience in Houston, Texas. And
Yeah.
that's where I see a lot of people fall on their face. They're like, "Well, I train the franchisees,"
Yeah.
and yet the next level down has
And,
complete.
and 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 imagine if you could go out there and put manager training or operational training for your franchisees and employees as well. How to greet an employee so that you have that level of consistency. Um, and so I mean, like I said, I think I've seen an emergence of that happening more and more so now with more established franchisors.
Mhm.
Um, but definitely, I think a low-hanging fruit for franchisors that are perhaps tight on money. They don't want to necessarily go out there and hire a whole bunch of staff on the training department, but they're in that mode where they're about to scale. I think an e-learning platform can certainly help.
Yeah, 100%. And I think everybody gets it. Just think about it in terms of interactivity, guys, not just content display. Don't go create a, what is it? What was that site everyone used to use all the time? Oodle or something like that when it first came out. But
Moodle.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, it's been a while, but that, yeah, I'm sure teachers are still using it. Public education, they're notorious for latching onto things that are free and okay because they just don't have budgets. But you've got to think beyond something like a Moodle. You've really
Yeah.
got it. You got to have interactivity. Those assessments that Jam just talked about are critical. Formative assessments, making sure people are getting it along the way, and
Hmm.
you also have to have the final assessments to make sure they've got comprehension of the content.
Yeah.
Otherwise, loop them back to the areas that they struggled in and make sure they can remediate so they can move on to the next
And I
section.
always and I always find that centralizing all that data in a single source of truth. I'm a big fan of that. You can always get best of breed e-learning platform, best of breed, whatever finance module, best of breed ticketing system. But now your data is housed in three different platforms, and now your support rep is required to be learned on all three of those, trained on all three of those.
Mhm.
And whereas in an all-in-one system, now they go to a franchisee profile page and they can see the tickets that this franchisee opened up in the last 30 days, which courses they have gone out there and completed, what their support requests were, what their emails were, how many times a support rep has contacted them or touched them, what are the notes from that support rep's call, so that you're never going in blind. You're never going in, without knowing what that franchisee has been experiencing the last 30, 60, 90 days. So I think an all-in-one system certainly goes out there and helps with that.
Yeah, 100% agree. And there are limitations sometimes, but the comprehensive data. Think of it this way, guys. If you've got a system like that, and you start to see an uptick in support tickets around. We talked about marketing before, but let's just say around like using the fryer, right? You probably need to then reevaluate your LMS, your learning content around how do we operate the fryer effectively, or maybe we don't even have a course on that. It seems so obvious to us, but
Hmm.
like you've got to take the data from system A. Your support system tends to be kind of a high level visibility into what you need to fix system wide. And if you can see trends there at all, then go and look at the learning content. Make sure you fix that first, so you can then train people properly and eliminate ahead of time those tickets from coming. Those are ways that you can take these all-in-one systems and start to really manage the process to make your franchisees more successful.
I always say that a system like that actually certainly helps, but before it helps, it'll expose you. Expose where your franchise system lacks, whether it's in training, whether it's in a process, whether it's in some support area. So it'll actually go out there and punch a bunch of holes, and you'll realize, hey, I got to do something there. But once you do that, once you plug that up, now you've got something that's much more refined and skilled.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Can't get better until it gets worse. Cool. Well, so Jam, let's shift gears just for a little bit. Talked about e-learning. We talked about helping to train people up. It, one of the things that I see a lot of franchise systems struggle with is just data. Can you talk about that? We've touched on it slightly in a couple of different contexts, but as a franchise system that's growing, how do they gather data? What are key data points and things they should be looking at system wide that will help govern their ability to grow?
Yeah, so, certainly some key data points, and they usually have it really nailed in, as you probably know, from your stuff, Dave, on the sales side. A lot of the franchise sales side, they've got some KPI metrics, how many leads to a qualified questionnaire, how many qualified questionnaire lead to a discovery day, how many discovery days to a deal. So they've got those metrics pretty refined.
Yeah.
On the operational side, sometimes not so much.
Mhm.
And I always find that if they are capturing finance data in the system, they're able to go out there and see if their locations are on track versus their benchmark.
Right.
And so I find that most franchisors are not going out there. First, they don't understand their benchmarking data, right? Especially the emerging brands, they don't. I think
Yeah.
established brands certainly do. But once they've got their benchmark data, how are you collecting finance data? The number of leads that are coming into their system, the number of deals that are being signed, average sign of time of deal. On the consumer side. If you're able to go out there and capture some of that data, then you're able to see, hey, this guy's royalty is right on par with where our benchmark is. This person's number of new customers signed on for the first 90 days, it's exactly where it needs to be.
Mhm.
I find that there's a lot of sophisticated franchisors using a BI tool for that. So they'll pull in data from their marketing team, they'll pull in data from their consumer facing CRM, their point of sale system, their operational data, and they'll put it into a BI tool, a business intelligence tool. Some of them are expensive. They're not cheap. And then you need a person that can be an analyst that can go in there and look at that bigger data and figure it out.
Mhm.
Fortunately for an all-in-one system, I think a lot of that data, you don't need to build those connections into a BI tool. A lot of that data can be gathered inside the single tool. And then figuring out if you've got an analyst, what measurement point there is. And I always find that the most critical period of a new franchisee is that first 12 to 24 months.
Mhm.
In that first 12 to 24 months, especially for brick and mortar, I mean, they're not even breaking even at that time, right? It takes a couple of years to get to that break even standpoint because the investment is so large.
Mhm.
And so knowing that along the way they're hitting the necessary goals revenue wise is so important. And you
Yeah.
can get that data because at the end of the day, that the lifeblood of that franchise or the collection of their ongoing fees, right? So if they
Yeah.
can see that person's on track using finance KPI data, that's always powerful.
Yeah, you mentioned the word benchmarking, and I want to circle back to that for a minute because in in franchising, oftentimes people will draw these benchmark lines and say, "Look, you've been with us for 12 months. You should be here." Like I really like the kind of the time frame based benchmarking, but there are other ways to splice that I've seen people do really well in the industry. If you can do regional benchmarking because and display that in some way that's helpful for the franchisees to realize, oh, my cost of goods is way out of whack, or I'm the number one. I've managed my cost of goods down to be the number one guy in this region. All of a sudden, as a franchisor, I'm not spending all my time trying to train people. I might say, hey, Frank over in Tallahassee has got this figured out. You're over in Orlando, Bob. Let's have you guys get together. Like it starts to reveal I think the true superpower of franchising isn't just the systems, it's the all the brains of the entrepreneurs that are running the system and some of the innovation that comes out of that. If you can harness that and figure out somebody who's the best at managing cogs, and you can see that in your data, that person should be on your next power up call training everyone how they do it. And franchisees, anyone who's been in it for a little while knows they would much rather listen to each other than to the franchisor. So you're also taking the load off of yourself by doing it.
Absolutely. And I've seen a lot of franchisors take some of their top operators and then bring them onto the franchisor side, meaning give them an actual job at the franchisor level,
Yeah.
so that they can go out there and replicate best practices for that area of their system.
Yeah, it's smart. It's so smart. Well, so let's talk just to wrap things up, Jam. One of the areas that a lot of franchisors struggle with is management and collection of royalties. And can you give us some advice on that? Like, obviously you guys do that in your platform. Others can do it too, but like, what are some things that someone should be thinking about operationally to make sure they're collecting the right royalties in the right way, and having some analytics to see what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, when you're an emerging franchisor with 1 or 2 or 3 locations, you can still go out there and manually collect the P&L, put
Yeah.
it into some type of a powerful spreadsheet that you have that runs some calculations, and you do that every collection period. So if you're collecting royalties or billing them weekly, once every 2 weeks, once a month, whatever that period is, now you're taking that one resource, which is going to be likely your controller, and that person's dedicated to going out there and running that. Now multiply that by 10. Now you got 10. All of a sudden, it's not that there's no time saving just because you're doing 10. It's just 10 times more work for that controller. And that's
Yeah.
only at 10 locations. And if you're running that twice a month, now you're taking hours and hours away where that person's just going to be dedicated to that.
Yeah.
And then if you ask them, hey, can you give me some information about what happened trend-wise over the course of the last 18 months for all of our franchise locations that were in Florida because there was a hurricane there and that may have adversely affected their business, it takes forever to go out there and run some type of analytics. In an ideal situation, if you had a system that can pull revenue data by location, so not relying on the franchisee to enter that data, but tying into a point of sale system where a system can pull in revenue data by location. If you could do that first and foremost.
Mm-hmm.
Or even if you're like, hey, I don't want to build that API connection. I have a POS system that nobody in the world uses. And so there's no integrations there, but I can at least get a spreadsheet by location and how much revenue was generated. Very simple, high level metrics. If you can just get that, you can import it into a system and then let the system go out there and calculate royalty fees based on revenue, percentage wise or flat rate, however you charge, technology fees, flat rate or percentage wise, marketing fees, collective advertising fees, whatever it is that you charge. So your slew of fees, have the system go out there and charge that against that revenue. Once the system does the calculations to show a summary sheet by location, so the controller can go in and say, the president of the company or the owner of the company gave this guy like a discount this month because he did some training for us, and manually adjust what's necessary. And then with a click of a button, send invoices containing the fees for any particular location to that respective location. Like if you could do that much, you're ahead more than 90% of the franchisors.
Yeah.
Can you imagine? Like 90% of the franchisors are not doing that much. And then to cap it all off, once you've sent that invoice, to have a system that can automatically process payment.
Mm-hmm.
So now it knows Jam sent an invoice calculating 10% royalty, 1% marketing fee, $300 flat rate technology fee, and a $200 whatever fee to Dave. And 24 hours later, it auto debits through an ACH Dave's account for the amount, and credits the franchisor's account, and then marks the invoice as paid inside the system. And if you could do that, now you got something pretty cool.
Yeah, well, not just something pretty cool, but you've got a guaranteed way to manage that process, which doesn't require human intervention and consistent data and analytics because you're not spending all your time doing collections with your franchisees. Yeah.
And it's an easy report that shows you who's paid, who hasn't paid. easy way to go out there and see, hey, is there an issue happening in a certain area because your revenue is down? You can run some, multi-month analysis. So, and having that also tie into like a bookkeeping system, like QuickBooks, for example. So every time an invoice is generated, sent to your franchisee, a copy of that invoice is sent into QuickBooks, so that you can do your own at the franchisor level bookkeeping and P&L.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a little bit of a dream, I'm sure, to some people listening in because they haven't got that far down the road. Jam, you're a very accessible person in the industry, and I'm grateful to have you on. You're a good friend as well, and I think a lot of people would love to know the best way to reach out if they have questions because you've covered a lot of topics a lot of folks would probably want to learn more about. What's the best way for people to reach out to you if they want to learn a little bit more or they have questions about some of the things we've talked about today?
Yeah, no, thanks, David. I appreciate you having me on here. And if anybody needs to reach me, I mean, you can find me on LinkedIn, Jam Hashmi, or if you'd really like, you can email jam@clicktext.com, JAM at clicktecs.com. I'm fairly accessible in either way.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And also show up to an industry event. I feel like every time I'm there, I see you there, and it's good to bump into you and hang out when we do. Guys, summary notes here. Systems are really critical. Often we talk about in this podcast unit level operation systems, but having a franchisor system to harness the power of the franchise network is really critical. And having visibility optics, setup tools, automations, the ability to plug in some AI to leverage the power of that technology and let your humans do what humans are best at, which is interacting with other humans and solving complex problems. It feels like we've got a lot of good content here. Jam, any summary notes you'd like to share with people as we wrap up?
I always find that a system should be scalable. You don't need to go out there. If all you need is one particular module today, let's say it's the opening module, you don't need to buy more software than you can ride. You know what I mean? So there's some software that are like you have to buy all of these other modules or all these other systems, but you just needed that one piece. So find something that can go out there and scale as your organization scales. I find that it's easy from a cash flow management perspective. It's easy from a training and adoption perspective. No support rep, no head office staff wants to, a person wants to go out there and be overwhelmed with learning 7 different systems. One at a time, and understand change management, right? It takes a bit of time for people to go out there and learn and adopt that new technology and become, accustomed to it. And I think those are things that you have to implement. It's a bit of a painful process in the beginning, but definitely one that yields great returns the longer that you utilize.
Yeah, great advice because in the industry, it's very common for people to spend too much money buying too much software and they only need 10% of it. So I appreciate that. Great way to wrap up. Jam, thanks so much. We appreciate your insights, guys. Jam, ClickText and FranchiseSoft if you want to find them. Thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks, everybody. All the best.